the differences in speaking and writing. Oral communication uses the elemental audio qualities of volume and pitch to configure a range of meanings as wide as that of any other mode. Oral representation takes the form of listening or interpreting the meanings in the oral language one hears. Oral communication takes the form of speaking or making an audible linguistic utterance that another person may hear. We have put oral meanings last in our discussion about the modes for a very particular reason. We have kept the discussion about oral meanings as far away from the discussion of written meanings as possible because we want to argue that oral language and written language are deceptively different. When schools teach phonics, it is on the assumption that learning to write and read in alphabetical languages is foundationally a business of learning sound-letter correspondence. However, we want to argue that oral and written meanings are so importantly different from each other that they are no more closely related than any other two other modes of meaning we have discussed so far.
I'm moving on now to the oral mode, and in a way it's very closely layered over the audio mode because the mode of transmission is through sound, and it's often related to sound in some ways that I'm going to talk about in a second. But firstly, before I do that, I want to talk about a couple of ways in which the oral mode is very different from writing. So we could have, in this schema, had a mode called language, but we actually wanted to separate out speaking and writing as two very different things. And the reason why we want to do it is to do with some particular challenges and particular issues that I'm going to elaborate on around literacy pedagogy. So there are reasons why we want to do this. It's not just purely an academic or theoretical exercise. So firstly, one common misconception is writing is a transcription of speech. So intuitively that seems to be the case because what you do is you sound out the letters. Alphabetical systems particularly are ways in which speech gets transcribed, the sounds of speech gets transcribed into writing, and so on. But one of this is a kind of a misconception because there's a lot of meaning carried in oral speech, which is not well represented at all in writing. So what happens is, in an area of speaking called prosody, which is the analysis of the sounds of oral speech, we look at emphases, we look at pauses, we look at intonation, we look at accents. Now, there's a discipline in linguistics called phonetics, which tries very hard by building this other obscure character set to capture exactly the sounds that are being spoken, but it really doesn't do it. There's no amount of transcription that you can do using even the character set of phonetics that really captures what's happening in oral language. So there's a lot of meaning packed in there. We do have things in written language which are aimed to capture something about sound. We have commas, and we have full stops, and we have question marks. But the thing about these things is a comma can never tell you how long the pause was. It might have been a very short pause or a very poignant pause. It can't tell you how insistent the question was. And perhaps maybe you put 3 question marks or 3 exclamation marks if it's an exclamation at the end. But even so, it doesn't really give you the exact quality of that sound, which is exactly modulated in the audio rendition. So what I'm really saying here is that there's meaning in the oral mode which we can try to capture to some degree in the written mode, but we can't quite. So writing is not simply a transcription of speech. That's a misconception. The second misconception is that writing has the same grammar as speaking, the same structure as speaking. So in other words, now you could probably go and unpack what I'm saying, and you could find nouns and verbs and adjectives, and they have all those functions that occur in written language, are occurring in oral language. But in fact, it is very, very different in a whole lot of ways. Firstly, what I'm saying is full of ums and ahs. full of things like I mean to say, and in a way, it's more like thinking aloud. It's full of repetitions, it's full of hesitations, it's full of revisions. You know, I stumble over something, I kind of correct it, I go back and think, oh look, I didn't quite say that thought that I had a few seconds ago very well. Let me restate it. I'm just, you know, this process of cycling back over things. And in fact, a listener barely notices it. So I'm now talking to the camera. I don't have a script. I'm not reading a teleprompter. I haven't thought it through in advance. And in fact, if you were to take a transcript of what I'm saying now to the camera, it's terrible writing. It's incoherent, all over the place, repetitive. It's horrible. So please don't try and transcribe what I'm saying, because I'm just speaking. I'm speaking kind of off the top of my head in this circular kind of way, and so on. So, and you as a listener, when you're, you know, you get used to not hearing that. You get not, you know, and all of a sudden, if you transcribe it, it becomes really obvious what bad writing my speaking is, and how, you know, it's what a messy pile of things I'm saying. But also, writing, speaking is characteristically situated. So here's a kind of a mental exercise. Imagine you're in a restaurant listening to the conversation on the next table, or you're in a bus listening to two people speaking on the bus. It's actually very hard to tell what they're talking about, because so much of what happens in the oral world is embedded in the world of experience, and you haven't been part of that experience. There are shared assumptions that are held between people, and in a way, characteristically, speaking is not very explicit. There's a lot of implicit stuff that goes on in speaking. Whereas writing, when you're at a distance, you've got to be explicit. So in other words, if you're going to use the word he, or you're going to use the word today in a piece of writing, somewhere up further in the text, you've got to have put the name of he, because otherwise you don't know who he refers to. And somewhere earlier in the text, before you say today, you've got to be clear what day it is, when it is. Is it yesterday, or is it 1864, that day? So writing is, in a way, explicit in a way that speaking is not. So in other words, the basic textual form of writing is very different. And one of the things about, and this is getting to my point now about literacy pedagogy, learning to write then is learning to do something fundamentally different from what you've ever done in speaking. It's learning to be explicit, it's learning to be concise, it's learning not to hesitate, to make all your corrections, and so on. So it's actually a very different form, and if we think that literacy is just about learning how to transcribe speaking, we're going to do our kids a disservice. It's a lot, in other words, do we think it's just phonics? We just get the phonics right and everything will be all right? Well, no, it's not. It's actually a fundamentally different form of representation of meaning in all these kinds of ways. But also, it does things like this. It's characteristically more passive. It's characteristically packs meaning into tighter spaces. So here's a little example taken from some work by Michael Halliday, the linguist. So I might have a phrase, I'm in a business and I'm talking about something abstract like the internalization of costs, right? That's what I write down. I'm writing a report and I mention the internalization of cost. It's something we must do, the internalization of costs. But what we mean by that is, and if I'm to put this into oral language, I'm talking to you now as another member of my team, I can say, look, we can keep the costs down by doing this ourselves. Now, we, who is we? Well, you and I together, but we haven't written that down explicitly. But also it's speaking subjectively about us, it's subjectively about our action, whereas when I talk about the internalization of costs, I'm talking about an abstract process. I've reframed it as an abstract process, which makes it seem objective, scientific, you know, full of management theory, full of a deep understanding of management. So, and that's characteristically what I do in writing and what I've learnt from writing. Mental processes I've learnt from writing. Now, these mental processes technically are called nominalization, turning verbs or actions which I actively do, into abstract processes or nouns of this kind, or noun phrases. So it's a matter of turning processes into products. It's a matter of using passive voice more than active voice. It's a matter of speaking and thinking objectively more than subjectively. These are classic transitions as we move from archetypical orality to archetypical writing. Now, in fact, they're exactly the transitions that kids need to make at school to get into academic thinking, science, history, technology studies, whatever they're doing at school. These are actually cognitive and conceptual moves. So again, to think that writing is just writing down what is said in speech, no, it's a completely new meaning system.